Welcome back to another edition of the Saturday to Sunday Football Podcast. I am Paul Perdichizzi, and thank you for joining me. As always, another week of the chaotic college football season is in the books. Another week of the NFL concluding tonight with another doubleheader on Monday Night Football. Here at Saturday to Sunday, we continue to break down all things 2025 NFL Draft. We look back at last year's rookie class in the NFL Rookie Report, and then we conclude with a Fantasy Dynasty Report, checking in on the Fantasy Dynasty value and the biggest topics from this past week of the NFL season in regards to your dynasty leagues. But as always, we kick it off with the NFL Draft Report for Week 8 of the college football season. And as always, so much to talk about, but let's kind of go right in. And the leading question for tonight, and we've been talking about it all year. A couple of weeks ago, I said, how many quarterbacks are in the race for QB1? And there's been times that maybe it was 4 or 5, and then I kind of narrowed it down to 3 a couple of weeks ago. But I think now where we sit right now, after Week 8 of the NFL season of the college football season, I think right now it's a 2-horse race for QB1. Is there time that can change? Yeah, I still think there's time. I think there's a lot of college football season. I think the playoff this year add a different dynamic where there's going to be more spotlight games than ever. And I think that could sway a little bit. And can somebody carry some momentum from the playoff picture into the pre-draft process and catapult themselves maybe into the mix? Yeah, I do think that's possible. But where we stand right now, I think when you really look at things, you basically say, I could see QB1 as Shadu Sanders this past week, 250 yards, 2 touchdowns. I don't think we just quite grasp or understand. There's always so much hoopla around Colorado. There's always so much hoopla around Shadu Sanders, all stemming from Prime, his dad being the coach. I've been very critical at times of Shadu Sanders in terms of his post-game conferences, where at times I don't see a lot of accountability, sometimes throwing O-linemen or players under the bus. But when you put all that aside, take away Travis Hunter, there's not a lot on that Colorado offense that's going to be playing at the next level. And Shadu Sanders continues week in and week out. A lot of times when Colorado is underdogs, games that they're supposed to lose, and he plays really well. He keeps them in games. He leads to upsets. So I think when we are so critical of every aspect of these quarterbacks, when you see what Shadu Sanders has done with a very lackluster supporting cast, a horrific offensive line, and he's elevated that team and that program to be respectable, to pull off some big upsets, I think that carries a lot of weight. I do think some of it is mitigated with his character questions and some of his comments publicly. But if that stuff we think could be under control at the next level, I do think his game rises to the occasion. I do think he's been in the spotlight for most of his life. And I do feel that he can handle that spotlight. And I think that's so critical as we see so many NFL prospects, especially quarterbacks, that the moment looks too big for them. So Shadu Sanders, he was in the mix before the season started to be QB1, and 8 weeks into the season, I think he's only further cemented his status to be in the QB1 mix. The guy who has risen now into that 1A, 1B with Shadu Sanders, I think is Cam Ward out of Miami. Now, Cam Ward is a guy I've been talking about for years. I liked him when he was in Incarnate Wood. Then he went to Washington State, and I liked him last year. But I still thought at that time he was more of a maybe late round 3, early round 4 prospect. There were so many aspects of his game that needed to be refined, cleaned up, the decision-making. He needed to limit the turnover-prone plays. And then he transfers to Miami, and we talked about it in the summer, that this was a huge opportunity for him to seize control of that program, that team, playing bigger games than we've ever seen. And all we've seen Cam Ward do is rise to the moment, put the team on his back with these star-studded performances. This past week, 21 of 32, 319 yards, 4 touchdowns, doing it again to get the victory for Miami. He has shown the ability to develop and harness some of those poor decision-making plays, but still be asked to do a lot. I don't think Miami is nearly one of the most talented teams in the country relative to some other teams, but he has put them on his back. He has carried them. He has been asked to do a lot in the second half of games, in the fourth quarter of games, and he has shined. So we knew he had the arm talent. We knew he had the mobility, the ability to play off structure, throw from different arm angles and different platforms. But now he's refined his game. Now he's shown that he can make better decisions under pressure. When he's playing off structure, he's shown the ability to limit the turnover-prone plays and the turnover-worthy plays. And now I think we've basically now put him in a situation where I think it's clearly right now through 8 weeks. We'll see what changes. But I think right now it's Shedeur Sanders, it's Cam Ward. Those are the two guys vying for QB1 at the moment. Guys who have fallen off since I last did this. Jalen Milroe has struggled in the last couple weeks. This past week, Tennessee gets the win over Alabama. We know that Alabama lost a couple weeks ago to Vanderbilt. 25 of 45, 239 yards, 1 touchdown, 2 interceptions. Milroe has been very inconsistent over the last couple of weeks since we had this discussion a couple of weeks ago when we were saying, could he be QB1? And I think he was on the trajectory to possibly be QB1. That has came back a little bit. I do think some perspective is needed. More has been asked of Jalen Milroe this year than any year he's been in college. 2, yes, they have Ryan Williams, who's an explosive freshman sensation, unbelievable prospect. This is also not the same Alabama team that we've seen over the last X amount of years with Nick Saban at the helm. Nick Saban's not there anymore. This team is not loaded with offensive skill players. This team is not loaded with a star-studded running back who's going to be, a top 100 pick. They still have a very good team. So I don't want to sit here and say he's not playing with Colorado. He's not playing with Shedeur Sanders supporting cast. But this is also as little as a talented team of Alabama as we've seen in the last however long Saban was there. So there has been more of Jalen Milroe. It's been asked more of him. We've seen some of these inconsistencies. I still think the raw traits are very intriguing. So yeah, right now, I don't think he is pushing Cam Ward or Shedeur Sanders to be QB1. And I'm not sure Alabama, with now their 2 losses, can really be in the mix to be in the playoff hunt. We'll see. But I still think there's a lot that will intrigue NFL teams with Jalen Milroe. He can make the vertical throw. He can push the ball vertically down the field. We know he has elite level athleticism. But I do think this right now is kind of a bad spot for him because we're seeing Anthony Richardson struggle. More athlete than passer coming out. Need to see him refine and develop. I'll talk more about him later. Jalen Hurts, while he's bailed out by the star-studded talent that's around him in Philadelphia, I think he's regressed a little bit. He came into the league, high-level athleticism, needed to refine and continue to refine that passing that we started to see when he went from Alabama to Oklahoma. We've seen Justin Fields, athlete. He was a good passer at Ohio State. He almost seems to have regressed in that mindset. So some of these struggles, we even see Josh Allen, but Josh Allen kind of got past this where we question him in terms of the up and down because he has shown enough winning from the pocket, winning with his arm. But we've seen guys regress this year, and we've seen guys regress in their career early in the NFL. So I do think right now, there might be more questions about Jalen Milroe, the thrower, than there is Jalen Milroe, obviously the complete package, the athleticism, the frame, stuff like that. But I do think there's still enough physical traits that will really intrigue NFL teams, combined with what appears to be pristine character and work ethic. So when you combine that with high-level athleticism, raw physical traits to make any NFL pro, push the ball vertically down the field, pretty good. I think he still intrigues teams. He's still the guy who I think could catapult himself back into that Shedeur Sanders and Cam Ward mix. But I think right now Cam Ward and Shedeur Sanders deserve to be the 1A, 1B, and be the clear two guys in the QB1 race as we sit here 8 weeks into the college football season. The other wild card, and I saw David Syvertson of Our Lads, we've had him on the show, unbelievable at evaluating talent. I think one of the best kept secrets on draft Twitter. If you're not following David's work, you need to be following David Syvertson. Is he recently updated his big board, and he has Garrett Nussmeier at LSU as his QB1. And he's talked about a little bit on Twitter. You can go check out his page if you want to see some more of his thoughts about it. But Garrett Nussmeier is a very interesting prospect. We've talked about him a lot. This past week, 23 of 34, 233 yards. LSU got a comfortable win over Arkansas when I think some people thought that might have been a little bit of a trap game for for LSU facing Arkansas. Nussmeier took care of business. Didn't put up gaudy stats or gaudy touchdown numbers, but had some really good throws. He's developing. Like mentioned last week, Dane Brugler, unbelievable at evaluating talent. Said he sees a little Tony Romo in him. So when Dane Brugler speaks, and when David Syvertson speaks, and when I've been intrigued by his game since week 1 of this season, there's a lot of buzz growing for Garrett Nussmeier. Is he ready? Am I ready to say he could be in the mix to be QB1? No, I think that's Shadu and Cam Ward right now. And I think Jalen Milroe and Garrett Nussmeier are now on the periphery as the next in line. Who I think right now, I don't see any scenario where he should be in the QB1 mix right now is Carson Beck. All summer, I watched as much Carson Beck as I can get. I liked him, but I didn't like him at the level that other people were liking him. And I thought I was missing something. And last year, I really didn't have him at the level of other people. I never thought he was a round 1 quarterback prospect when I was watching him live during last college football season. But then there was starting their buzz that if he declared, he might be a first-round pick. Could he go ahead of guys like Michael Penix and Bo Nix and stuff like that? And I didn't see that last year. And now this year, yeah, Georgia doesn't have as much talent this year, similar to Alabama in terms of offensive skill players. But it's still Georgia. He's still playing with tremendous amount of talent. He's still playing with a great supporting cast. He's still playing with a great O-line. And Carson Beck has been really poor this year in the grand scheme of things. And this past week, I know Georgia got the win over Texas, and it was a big team win. 175 yards, 3 interceptions for Carson Beck. They won in spite of him this week, not because of him. I have a hard time thinking an NFL team in the top 5 or top 8, which is probably a poor team, is going to look at Carson Beck and say to themselves, this is the guy who's going to come in and be able to rise the tide, to get past the poor quarterback, the poor supporting cast, and make us relevant again. Now, could a team still could he do well down the stretch? A team fall in love with him like Denver fell in love with Bo Nix? Sure, I think that's possible. So I'm not going to sit here and say he's not a first round. He has no shot at the first round anymore. I don't think he's a first round talent anymore. I think he's more of a day 2 type talent. So, but there's enough of a season left that maybe, and enough big games left that maybe he can change the tide. I also think Quinn Ewers, we saw him get benched for part of that game. Arch Manning came in. They ended up going back to Quinn Ewers. He ended up throwing for 211 yards and 2 touchdowns in the comeback attempt there by Texas versus Georgia. We wanted to see that refinement and growth, kind of what I was talking about, Cam Ward, from Quinn Ewers. And we started to see it early in the year. And then I feel like that injury kind of derailed Quinn Ewers' momentum. And now I wonder if he can get it back. And now I wonder if Texas has another stumble and maybe they're not in the title picture. Do they pull the plug and go to Arch Manning? And what that does to Quinn Ewers' stock. So I think Carson Beck and Quinn Ewers right now are in the next tier down after the Garrett Nussmeier and Jalen Milroe still. So I think it's that Cam Ward, Shadu Sanders, 2-man race for QB1 right now. I still think teams are going to be intrigued by Jalen Milroe, and I think teams are starting to be intrigued with Garrett Nussmeier. Tier below that, I think, is where you see guys like Carson Beck and Quinn Ewers. And then after that, you still have guys like Miller Moss in the mix, Drew Aller in the mix, guys like that. So it's gonna be fascinating to see, like, does everybody that we expect to declare? Is there any surprises in that regard? And then it's, how does the NFL view these guys and these prospects? Is it a year that we thought there might be 4 or 5 quarterbacks who go in the top 15, and does it end up being 1 or 2, and then we don't see anybody else in round 1? We know NFL teams look ahead. And when you look ahead, you're talking about Nico, and you're talking about Arch Manning, and maybe 1 or 2 of these guys don't declare and they go back to school. And then you're talking about them in the mix. So there's a couple paths where teams might say, yeah, we're not going to. And then you see the success of Baker Mayfield after he bounced around. You see the success of Geno Smith after he bounced around. We're seeing the success of Sam Darnold after he bounced around. Do teams look at some guys that are out there and think that they could be a reclamation project and not pull the plug on a rookie in round 1 and say, you know what, we're going to try the reclamation project first. And if that doesn't work, then maybe next year's class is even stronger. And again, I think right now that would be Sam Darnold. If the Vikings don't tag him, or if they tag him and look to trade him, maybe a team looks at that. There's not a lot of other guys that jump to the forefront. Is there another team that looks at Justin Fields and wants to consider him? We know he went 4-2, but 4-2, and then Pittsburgh pulled the plug on him. So, I still think there's a lot of question marks about him. My guess is Daniel Jones is going to be available when the Giants move on from him. Does a team look at him as a bridge quarterback and say, maybe we can get a little bit more consistency out of him? As someone who's watched every Daniel Jones play, I highly doubt it. But these are the questions that NFL teams are going to be asked with now, because they might say, do I want to pull the plug on a quarterback in the top 10 or top 15 and push them up the board there? Or do I want to just get something for a year, see if we find lightning in a bottle like Tampa Bay did, Minnesota did, Seattle did, and then go back to the well next year in a deeper quarterback class? It's going to be interesting. I think that'll dictate how many quarterbacks go in round 1, how many quarterbacks go in the top 50. If we keep this going and kind of get off the quarterbacks here, because, a lot of a quarterback discussion there to kind of start the show. But there wasn't a lot of other things that really jumped out in terms of draft eligible prospects this week. At the running back position, a new name, Basil Tuden out of Virginia Tech, the senior 5'11", 209. He had 266 yards rushing this week and a touchdown versus Boston College. He's almost at 900 yards for the season. So he's a guy I have not had eyes on besides watching some Virginia Tech games live. He's an interesting name that I'm kind of putting on my radar now. Want to check him out. With those type of numbers and production, you might see him at one of the senior all-star games, whether it's the Shrine Bowl or the Senior Bowl. So I think Tuden's a guy that's got to be put on the radar now to kind of check him out. We saw Ollie Gordon, I think it was on Friday night. He Oklahoma State had a standalone game, 107 yards, 2 touchdowns. I still think he's a top 5 back in this class. I know it's been a little bit up or down, but to me, after Ashton Genty, no other running back has really kind of pushed himself to the forefront. I think Gordon's in the mix there with Hampton, the Ohio State guys. I think those are the kind of guys that have put themselves in the mix. So Gordon showed, for a man his size, his frame, quick feet, some surprising athleticism. You saw that in full effect on Friday night. Dylan Sampson out of Tennessee, all he continues to do is produce 139 yards and 2 touchdowns in that game versus Alabama this past week. He's another guy who I think's elevated his stock to be a Dave caliber prospect. See him in moving forward in an all-star game as well. And then in that Georgia-Texas game where Georgia ended up rolling pretty comfortably, Trevor Etienne, 87 yards and 3 touchdowns. They really leaned on the run game there as Beck struggled in that game as well. Etienne is a guy who I have kind of pegged as a early Dave type prospect in that round 4, round 5 mix. If we take this to the pass catchers, I just wanted to make note, because we talked about Tyler Warren last week. Is he tight end 1? I think he's very much in the mix there with Colston Loveland. I also don't think we realize just how poor the Michigan offense is. I think some people do, but just how impressive what Loveland's been doing. even amongst those circumstances that have that and the issues that Michigan offense has shown this year, the fact that he's still going out as the clear focal point of that pass offense and producing 7 catches for 83 yards, like that's a good stat line for a tight end. And he's doing it on a broken offense, on an offense that struggles to move the ball, an offense that struggles to score points, especially in the pass game. So Loveland continues to at least put up pretty solid numbers. I think that shows the level of prospect that Loveland is. So I did kind of want to mention him right there. At the wide receiver position, a couple Maryland prospects, Caden Prater and Ty Felton. I've talked, Prater was in the summer shows. I talked about him a little bit during the year. Same thing with Ty Felton, who's going to be an add to the scouting notebook. Both of them this past week. Prater, 9 catches, 111 yards. Felton, 9 catches, 84 yards and a touchdown. I don't think any of them are top 100 prospects, but I do think they both enter the mix when you're starting to talk about round 4, round 5 caliber wide receivers. Very intrigued with both of their skill sets. Prater, very good at the catch point, body control, ball skills. Felton, can get vertical, get behind secondary and the corners and put that vertical shot. So I think that he has a different dynamic there than Prater. Tej Johnson last week, it was Evan Stewart. This week, Tej Johnson, 7 catches, 66 yards and a touchdown. I do wonder, I brought it up before, like the league views things, like right now I talked about the athletes at the quarterbacks who have taken a little bit of regression this year. I do wonder if a situation like Tank Dell, where he was so electric that first year, and now we've seen him not really be much of an impact for Houston, even though I still like the player a lot and think he'll right the ship. I think it's been a little bit of a weird year for him with the addition of Stephon Diggs. Then he got injured. CJ Stroud is kind of taking a little bit of a regression this year as well. But Tej Johnson, we know the size and frame are going to be concerns. Does Tank Dell struggles this year potentially, open up some more concern or criticism for Tej Johnson? I think Tank Dell was more of an outside receiver in a slot body. I think Tej Johnson is a slot wide receiver in a slot body and frame, and that's where he's going to be, have to be looked at the next level. But I still come back to the fact that Wan'Dale Robinson was a top 50 pick in the NFL draft. And I liked Wan'Dale, but he was not the explosive playmaker that a guy like Tej Johnson was. So I look at a guy like Tej Johnson and still think teams are going to be looking at his big playability and his speed. I find a hard time to think he doesn't go somewhere in round 2 or round 3. Still think he's a top 100 prospect for sure, even with the concerns about his size and frame. And I did want to bring up Sam Brown. Obviously, he was a guy I talked a lot about in the summer. I really thought he could make the next step and possibly be, Cam Ward's go-to guy there in Miami. Hasn't really materialized as much, but I wonder if this week's game, 3 catches, 125 yards and a touchdown. He's got big time athleticism. He's got wheels to get behind secondary. I'm interested to kind of see him the second half of this year as Miami gets into more important games, how Sam Brown looks, because I do think he's a guy that could kind of find his footing second half of the year and kind of catapult that to maybe an intriguing draft slot for the 2025 NFL draft. Let's take this over now to the Sunday aspect. Again, not a lot standing out in terms of the underclassmen, so nothing that I really wanted to harp on in terms of the Devy report. So I do think let's skip right into the Sunday aspect of it and talk about the NFL rookie report for week 7 of the NFL season. At the quarterback position, Drake May in that game in London, 26 of 37, 276 yards and 2 touchdowns. Listen, the supporting cast, dreadful. The O-line, dreadful. The wide receivers, dreadful. No running game. Creative play calling, not there. There's everything that could be wrong around Drake May is wrong. And with that said, he has made the offense competent and functional in his 2 games played with everything around him. And I think he has shown why I love them as a prospect. And yeah, there's going to be ups and downs, especially with that supporting cast, but he has elevated their offense in a short amount of time to at least be functional. He's a guy who it wasn't like he was playing on a stacked team at UNC. He's played with poor O-lines. He's played with suspect supporting casts. And he elevated, his team at UNC. I think he could do the same thing for New England. I think he's already done it in 2 games, so at least made them a functional team, even with some of the chaos surrounding him. And he's not playing with a very creative mind in terms of OC. I think when things get a little bit better there in New England, Drake May is going to be at the forefront of that and could be a big high-end real life quarterback, fantasy quarterback. I'm still a big believer in Drake May. I always thought this past year's quarterback class was a big 3 with Caleb Williams, Drake May, and Jaden Daniels before a big drop-off. I still feel that way. So we're nice to, now be checking in on Drake May week to week. Jaden Daniels got injured. Sounds like it's nothing too serious. I think he'll be back this week. If he misses a game, my guess is it would just be 1 or so. But listen, we knew there was always going to be some concerns about, his frame and holding up in the NFL. I think he's done a pretty good job so far, minimizing big hits that obviously help the cause. But hopefully it's a very short-lived injury, and he's back on the field this week. Washington cruised this past week over Carolina, even without him. So we'll see if he gets back on the field for Sunday. In terms of the running backs, I did want to make note of the fact that Tyrone Tracy stayed the lead back this week, even with the return of Devin Singletary. Now, the Giants were dreadful. Their offense is broken. No Andrew Thomas. I don't know if you're going to get any fantasy viability from the Giants running backs, but it is intriguing to note that Tyrone Tracy was the clear lead in this backfield, even with Devin Singletary healthy this week. I don't see a lot of reason for the Giants to not really give Tyrone Tracy a real opportunity to see if he can be their lead guy moving forward, a young, very cost-efficient player as they're trying to build up the rest of this roster, moving forward here and hopefully finding the quarterback of the future for themselves. Ray Davis, he played last Monday night, so I didn't get a chance to talk about him. Ray Davis looked great in that spot start for James Cook last Monday night. Looked good again this week. He didn't have a lot of touches because James Cook did come back. He had a late touchdown in that game, but Ray Davis is making a name for himself. I think it's going to be more of a 1-2, not a 1A, 1B, but I did like Ray Davis coming out. I love the power, low center of gravity, strong leg drive. I think he complements James Cook very nicely, but I do think James Cook, when he's healthy, is going to be the clear guy. I just think he's explosive. They like his all-around game, and I think Ray Davis is going to be a good complement to him, but it's a clear 1-2, just like Breece Hall to Braylon Allen. We started to see that revert back to a clear 1, clear 2, even a little bit Bijan Robinson like that. I think that's more of what this is, and some people might have thought it might have been a 1A, 1B, split committee. I don't think it's going to be that. I think James Cook is too prolific for that to happen, but I do like Ray Davis as well. At the wide receiver position, Brian Thomas, in that morning London game, up against Christian Gonzalez, performing 5 catches, 89 yards, and a touchdown. I think the question starts to become is how high should Brian Thomas be in positional dynasty ranks? I tried to do a quick update this morning. I got him to 16, and honestly, I think it's too low. I think you can make the case that he might even be in the mix around 11 or 12. I think the question about whether or not him or Rome Odunze should be higher is legit debate. I think questions about like him or Rashee Rice are legitimate. It's hard to gauge Puka Nacua right now, who obviously was unbelievable last year, but then was injured. We haven't seen yet, so I still have Puka ahead of him. But I think Rashee Rice, guys like Chris Olave, Rome Odunze, now that's the mix we're talking about here, which is going to put him somewhere in that 11 to 15 mix right now. He's been unbelievable. I think we're starting to see that my concerns, and not just mine, everyone's concerns about him were, can he run a full route tree? Can he be more refined as a nuanced route runner and develop more? I had some concerns that maybe he was just going to be limited to a few routes early in his career, very DK Metcalf-ish. And even if he was DK Metcalf, that still would have been a really high-end prospect, but I just didn't know if it was going to fully, because we've never seen DK Metcalf be a top 12 receiver, and he's never been top 12 in dynasty ranks. He's been a wide receiver too for most of his career. And I think the same thing with Brian Thomas. I thought he was going to be very DK Metcalf-ish. And we've seen DK Metcalf be a very good player. I don't think we've ever seen DK Metcalf be a great player. And there's been a reason why at times Tyler Lockett was the more productive receiver. I thought that might have been the case with Brian Thomas. I feel like he has quickly put that to bed. He has shown that there is more there. Now, he just wasn't asked to do it at LSU because they had Malik Neighbors. But I do think there's more there than we thought was there. He's shown more route running refinement. I think there's more to go in his game. We knew he had great ball skills. We knew he could win vertically, but he's shown a more completeness to his game that I think has him in that mix already to be a top 15 overall dynasty wide receiver. And that's how he should be valued moving forward. Other wide receivers, I was kind of expecting a little bit of a bigger bump for Xavier Worthy. Came out of the bye, even with all the injuries of that KC offense, we still didn't see a lot from him. We saw Patrick Mahomes using Mecole Hardman, and last week it was Juju Smith, and Noah Gray's been heavily involved. And I'm looking for Worthy to kind of develop into that guy who gets like a consistent 8-9, targets. And right now, it doesn't appear that that's the role they envision for him right now. So they must have some concerns about putting that on his plate as a full arsenal of what they ask him to do. But, Kansas City needs him to step up. I know they're 6-0, but they are doing it, in a very different way. They're doing it with very much a great defense and an opportunist offense. Mahomes making plays here or there, but there is no threat of a big play besides the occasional shot to Worthy. They have a hard time sustaining drives and keeping the chains moving, throughout the game. They seem to get the drive when they need the drive, and that's why they're 6-0, and that's the greatness of Mahomes. But Worthy has not stepped into that bigger role that I assumed we were going to see once Rashee Rice went down after the bye. Still kind of waiting to see that. Keon Coleman had his best game of his career, early portion of his career here. 4 catches, 125 yards. It'll be interesting to kind of see second half of the year. Now with Amari Cooper there, if they can get Keon Coleman going in the second half of his rookie year, Khalil Shakir, I think, is what he is, a very productive inside receiver. They could start to be a little bit more dynamic on the offensive side. And if they can start getting more production from Coleman and mix that in with now the addition of Amari Cooper, I think we're going to start seeing a lot more productive, sustainable offense from Buffalo. And there's been some inconsistency of that this year. At the tight end position, we saw Jatavian Sanders play his best game, 6 catches, 61 yards. And then Brock Bowers, I don't know what more is to say. Like, he's now clearly separating himself from all other tight ends in terms of what he's bringing to the table, in terms of dynasty value relative to other tight ends. 10 catches, 93 yards. He's became the focal point of that offense. They're basically using him as a straight wide receiver at times. I mean, this is the dream for fantasy people, or even teams who draft these prolific, athletic, pass-catching tight ends. They want to see him utilized in the passing game. Don't ask these guys to do things. It was like when the Giants were asking Evan Ingram to block too much. That was not what he was drafted for. And we see it time after time. We see how many times Dalton Kincaid comes off the field for Dawson Knox. Why? Like, you want to bring on Dawson Knox, then bring on Dawson Knox and make Dalton Kincaid your slot wide receiver because he's a better receiver probably than Khalil Shakir. Why are you wasting snaps with Dalton Kincaid as your, inline tight end? And I think sometimes teams just don't get it in terms of drafting these prolific tight ends, in terms of what they want their role to be. It's clear early on that Vegas understands who Brock Bowers is, what he isn't, and is maximizing his skill set and using him in how he should be used as a prolific pass catcher, lined up in a variety of alignments and formations to get him matched up with the right matchup so he can be a major weapon in the pass offense. And then let's conclude tonight with a quick fantasy dynasty report. Listen, I think the conversation at the quarterback position continues to be the very inconsistent play of quarterbacks across the board. I think we look at Anthony Richardson, CJ Stroud, and Patrick Mahomes. If you were in a startup dynasty draft before the NFL season, Mahomes was likely QB1 or QB2. CJ Stroud was either QB2 or QB3, and Anthony Richardson was probably QB5 to QB7. If we did a startup dynasty draft right now, none of those values are even remotely the same moving forward. We do not have Patrick Mahomes as QB1 or QB2. There's no way CJ Stroud would be the QB2 or QB3 right now. And there's absolutely no way Anthony Richardson would be QB5 to QB7. It's not even close on those guys. It's been a couple years now since Patrick Mahomes has been an elite fantasy quarterback. Take the real life out of it. He's still the best quarterback in the league. He might go down as the greatest of all time when it's all said and done. But in terms of the fantasy aspect, he has been a far cry from an elite dynasty asset. Like to the point where people, like I know in one league next week, I'm going to make the decision. I got to bench either Patrick Mahomes, Sam Darnold, or Tua if Tua's back. And I'm strongly contemplating benching Patrick Mahomes and playing Sam Darnold and Tua in his first game back. And I'm not alone in that, right? I don't like talking about my leads but I just use that as a point of reference where there's a lot of people, whether it's one quarterback, whether it's super flex, whether it's two quarterback, where he's no longer the best option and it's hard to click his name and put him as a reserve. But if you just look by the numbers and you realize how Kansas City plays, they are the most creative inside the 10-yard line offense that I've ever seen in the history of football. They score on these end arounds, these different trick plays, and usually they're all rushing plays, which takes the ball out of Mahomes' hands. They love running inside because teams are worried about Mahomes, and I still think they probably are playing a little bit lighter, and then they run it up the gut with Pacheco when he's there, or recently Kareem Hunt. He just does it. Their defense is great, so they don't get into shootouts. They're rarely pushed where Mahomes has to throw the ball 45 or 50 times a game. And he's a good runner, but he's not going to run a lot. It's more by, necessity in the moment than any design plays. So you're not going to get a lot there. So he's a very tricky dynasty quarterback because I feel like any year there could be a re-explosion for 40 or 50 touchdowns. But I think things would have to dramatically change. Their defense would have to take a major step back. They'd have to be playing these shootout games, falling behind by 14 or 17 in the fourth quarter and be in comeback mode for, I think, Mahomes to really push it. They'd have to get more consistent wide receiver play, something they haven't seen since Tyreek Hill left. So there's a lot of factors in play that would have to change for, I think, him to get back to that elite dynasty QB. CJ Stroud, I know he misses Nico Collins, but even before Nico Collins got injured, Nico was looking great this year. But the Houston pass offense wasn't. And when Joe Mixon's been available, they have played very much a ball control style of football and asked CJ Stroud to be much more game manager than focal point of that offense. I'm not saying that means much, but I do know last year, CJ Stroud was the focal point of that Houston offense. They didn't have Joe Mixon. They didn't have a stronger run game. Right now, I don't know if they feel like that's the best way for them to win. I don't know if that's what they want long term. But CJ Stroud does not look nearly the same as he was last year. I get it. Nico Collins is one of the elite wide receivers in football. Without him, but 86 yards. Green Bay does not have a good defense, especially a good pass defense. And he looked horrendous this past week. And they just don't look like they have a good defense. They're not going to be pushed too often. This week, they actually got into a pretty much of a shootout, and they still barely passed the football. So CJ Stroud, where we knew he doesn't have that running component. So for him to be an elite dynasty quarterback, you needed 38, 40, 41 touchdowns. And we thought that was in the realm of possibility. We needed 4,500 yards. Just not the way they're going to play. So I think that comes into question long term. And then Anthony Richardson, anyone who's been a long time listener knows how much I like Anthony Richardson. But Anthony Richardson is a guy who the experience is extremely limited. He was a developmental guy that needed to play last year to continue to refine and develop his passing skills. He played great in the limited sample that he had last year. But everything with him last year revolved around using his athleticism, making his running component a major factor, and that then led to big shot plays. We saw it week 1 of this year. We have not seen it in a game since. And the weird thing is, before the injury and now after he came back, we're just not seeing a lot of design runs. We're not seeing him take off. We're not seeing him run near the goal line. If he's not going to be a big-time runner, if he's not going to be a goal line monster like Josh Allen and Jalen Hurts, I don't think there's high-end fantasy QB1 potential anymore. That needs to be his game. And it needed to be his game in the first couple years of his career. Because just like Jalen Hurts was productive when he first started, and then the passing kind of came along a little bit, and then A.J. Brown really solidified his passing aspect of it, but now we've even seen it regress a little bit. Anthony Richardson needed to be the guy who is the cheat code, because every week he was rushing for 40 to 50 yards, scoring a rushing touchdown like every other week, and then still have games where he threw for 225 to 250 yards and scored at least one, if not two, passing touchdowns some weeks, right? When he had one touchdown, it was a good week. When he had two passing touchdowns on top of the running stuff, it was a great week. But right now, they look like, and this was from the early portion of the year, you weren't seeing him run inside the 5-yard line. They were using Jonathan Taylor. And I'm not saying that that's a bad decision. Maybe they were trying to protect him. He suffered the season-ending injury last year. But if he's not running, if that's not the focal point of his game to get him started, I feel like when he runs, and he runs effective, and he runs early in the game, it makes him a better all-around player. And right now, we're just not seeing him heavily involved in the run game. And I think then if he's not that, there's a lot of refinement and development needed before he's going to be a guy that's wins mostly in the pocket and just runs a little bit. I don't see QB1 value if that's going to be the case. QB1 value for Anthony Richardson comes from 600, 700 yards rushing in a season, maybe 800 yards rushing. You know, he was a guy where you really thought about, okay, like minimum 30 to 40 yards a week, minimum doing that. And then 7, 8 touchdowns rushing. And then on top of that, okay, maybe he averages like 215, 220 passing and throws for like 23 to 25 touchdowns. If he did that on top of 600, 700 yards rushing and 8 or 9 rushing touchdowns, well, now you're talking about the elite quarterback, fantasy quarterback. But if he's not rushing like that, it changes everything. And if you're trying to make him a true pocket passing quarterback right now, I think it's going to blow up in their face. And we've seen it blow up in their face. Right now, the Colts look better with Joe Flacco, considerably. I don't think they lose that game yesterday to Miami if Joe Flacco is the quarterback. But they're in a tough spot because they're not a Super Bowl team this year. So you kind of just got to ride it out with Anthony Richardson and see what he is. But if they don't start letting him loose, it's kind of like the Giants all these years. And I'm not saying Daniel Jones is on the level of Anthony Richardson from a prospect, because I don't think that. But every year Daniel Jones comes back from an injury, the question always becomes, are they going to cut back his running? Should they limit his rushing? And every year the answer is a definitive no. Because if you take away Daniel Jones's running ability and don't make that a strong factor of his game, he's not a starting quarterback in the NFL. That sets up Daniel Jones, the passer. And without him being a weapon running, he's not good enough as a quarterback passing the ball. To me, Anthony Richardson is very similar. He's not good enough yet, and maybe ever, as a pure passer, a guy who's going to win from the pocket. He needs to play off structure. He needs to have the running aspect be a major factor. Injury be damned. If he gets hurt, he gets hurt. But you won't get the best out of Anthony Richardson, I don't think, if he's not running a lot every single week. Design runs, taking off and running if the first read's not there, getting him in the end zone, making him, an important part of that, inside the 5, inside the 10 offense. Get him some touchdowns that way, get him going. Like, that's got to be the focal point. And it was in limited time last year. And then when the running really started to take off, the play action stuff, the vertical shots started to take off, playing a little bit more in rhythm. We're just not seeing it right now. And that's leading to a lot of the inconsistencies we've seen. At the running back position, Tank Bigsby, best game of his career. Stock continues to go up on Tank Bigsby. I'd want to get him right now. I think people still might be a little concerned about Travis Etienne. I think Tank Bigsby is worth a probably mid-second round rookie pick right at the moment, with his stock going up. Kyron Williams, I thought we were going to see a little bit of a step back this year. I had a lot of concerns that Blake Corum was going to take that job or at least make it a timeshare sooner rather than later. Kyron Williams is basically iced out Blake Corum. He is far surpassed, I think, my expectations and most people's expectations. He's a bona fide stud at the running back position. I don't think this is a flash in the pan or a temporary thing. I think he's going to be the guy there for, X amount of years. As listen, running backs come and go fast, but I don't think, I think Kyron Williams is going to be the focal point there for another couple of seasons, and Blake Corum will mix in. And if Kyron Williams gets hurt, I think Blake Corum could seize, and be great. But I think I don't think it's Kyron Williams is giving up that job anywhere near, or a portion of that job anywhere as much as I thought prior to the season starting. Kenneth Walker, I think the question stops to become is how high is too high now in running back dynasty rankings? Is he top 5? If he's not top 5, he's in the top 10. And I think you can make the case he's probably 7, 8 around there if you don't feel comfortable putting him over that. But he is totally put Zach Charbonnet on the back burner. And I knew that was inevitable. Anybody, again, to this day, like, it was night and day. It was apples to oranges. They weren't even on the same stratosphere as prospects. Kenneth Walker, explosive, big playability. Charbonnet was more of a plotter. His receiving production in college was very fabricated. Kenneth Walker is just as good of a pass catcher as is Zach Charbonnet. Zach Charbonnet is not the definition of a pass catching back. Pass catching backs are usually guys who can run really good routes, can make people miss. None of that is Zach Charbonnet's game. Zach Charbonnet is a between the tackles runner who's functional at catching the ball and can be a serviceable pass catcher out of the backfield. But he is in no way the third down prototype or the change of pace prototype. Kenneth Walker could be just as good as Zach Charbonnet as a pass catcher. And I think we started to see Seattle put a lot more on Kenneth Walker's plate from that regard. And I don't see Zach Charbonnet ever becoming a 1A, 1B anymore with Kenneth Walker. It's a clear handcuff and a big-time starter. Like, to me, the gap between Kenneth Walker and Zach Charbonnet is just as big, if not bigger, than it is Bijan Robinson to Tyler Algier or Breece Hall to Braylon Allen. I think Braylon Allen's talent is better than Zach Charbonnet. I think Tyler Algier's talent is better than Zach Charbonnet. And I think Kenneth Walker now has totally made that, separated that considerably, that if he's not being valued properly as an elite dynasty running back, top 5 to top 8, I would aggressively try to acquire him. At the wide receiver position, the Amari Cooper trade, I kind of alluded to it before. I think it really saves Amari Cooper's value for this year and probably next. I think it pushes Khalil Shakir back to more like a wide receiver 5-ish, which is probably the best role for him in terms of fantasy. I do think it hurts Dalton Kincaid a little bit. He hasn't really been living up to the hype, and now they have a veteran wide receiver in Amari Cooper who can play inside, can play outside. A lot of different things you could do to Amari Cooper. And Dalton Kincaid just isn't being utilized enough, I think, to give us back that elite fantasy production. I think he's still a good tight end, and he's still a good fantasy asset because tight end is devoid of a lot of talented players. But unless he's going to eventually be on the field 80, 90% of the snaps, I just think it's going to be hard for him to be a consistent tight end 1, tight end 2 overall, which I think some people thought maybe he had that upside to be. We just feel like they're going to kind of spread it around there. And now with Amari Cooper, the clear go-to guy. And then we'll see how Keon Coleman develops and Shakir gets his, and they pass to the running backs. And, it leaves Kincaid with some targets, but not the heavy target share where we thought it might have been, some crazy number, before the year started. If that didn't materialize this year when they didn't have anything there, it's hard to see it happening moving forward because we got Cooper there. I think they realize that they need to keep the arsenal of weapons there. And I don't think they're going to look at Keon Coleman as the be end all. So they could still go back to the well down the line to find another wide receiver, in a year or in this year's draft or the following year's draft or free agency to kind of keep a high-end talent there. we see the best out of Josh Allen when that's the case. We saw what he looked like with Stephon Diggs, without Stephon Diggs this year. So it's hard to see if Kincaid didn't seize the opportunity right now to be the focal point of that offense. Not sure he ever does. So I think he's a good asset in Dynasty, but far from what we thought about him, in the summer leading into this season. The Devontae Adams trade, I think it puts a damper on Garrett Wilson for this year and probably next, depending on if Adams is there next year. I wouldn't drop him too far. To me, he's still in the peripheral of that top 10. But we haven't seen, we thought this might have been the year where he finally put together an elite year. Didn't materialize, didn't happen. So now I think the question becomes, can he get back to that? And if so, when? Brandon Ayuk, unfortunately, season-ending injury tore his ACL. I think that's going to be major questions. We didn't see him be the elite player he was heading into this year. Yeah, the holdout. Now this happens. We have uncertainty about Deebo Samuels in San Francisco. A lot of moving parts with Brandon Ayuk. Still love the player, but he was also an older prospect. He wasn't like, he's older than people think. So like there more questions start to come to the forefront with Brandon Ayuk. Jackson Smith-Njigba, is there a ceiling there anymore? I think that question has to legitimately be asked. Is there a ceiling on Jackson Smith-Njigba? Or is he just a number 2, number 3 type target wide receiver on a team? And if he's a number 2, number 3 target wide receiver on a real NFL team, then he's probably a wide receiver 3 ceiling for fantasy and more like probably a wide receiver 4-5 if we're really being honest with ourselves. If he's somebody's number 2 or number 3 real life NFL wide receiver, then that's not going to materialize to wide receiver 2 or wide receiver 3 numbers for fantasy. It's going to be more like wide receiver 4, which I think he's kind of a wide receiver 4-5 right now. And his ceiling is maybe top 36. I think people who are holding out hope that maybe he could be top 24, maybe we see it at one point. But I think, Seattle's had a pretty good year passing the ball. He still hasn't clearly pushed Tyler Lockett out of the picture. If he was a prolific player, I'm not saying, listen, Tyler Lockett has had a great career. But when you're a prolific young wide receiver, you push other guys down the depth chart, right? It's just the way it works in the NFL if you're that talented. And Smith-Njigba just hasn't done that yet. And I'm not sure he's definitely going to do that. I don't think Seattle needed to go into this year saying, oh, we need Tyler Lockett to stay the second most important wide receiver. I think they would have been totally fine if he got pushed down to a more limited role and Smith-Njigba, became a more important role. So I do think that's something to follow. If he still has the name value and people are still looking at him as maybe a guy who could be a top 24 overall wide receiver, I'd probably trade out. I think you got to look at him as a ceiling as a wide receiver 3 now and wait and see. He's got to do work to even become a wide receiver 3 in fantasy moving forward. And if someone still thinks he's a top 20 type dynasty asset, I would, or still could be that, I think I'd pull the trigger and get out from him. And then Drake London, I talked about some guys in that top 10 mix, top 15 mix. I think Drake London is now squarely in the top 15 mix. Big time producer. The offense is running through him. They're lining him up in the slot. They're doing a lot with Drake London. Love the way the Falcons have been utilizing him this year. He'd be a guy still very much buying if I can get my hands on him. Probably going to be pretty hard right now, but I do know that people always get pick hungry as the draft picks are coming up. So maybe you can make an aggressive offer a number 1 and number 2 round pick for a guy like Drake London. And if some team maybe pulls the trigger on that, I would definitely do that. So I would definitely check in with the Drake London owner, see, what it would cost to get him. If people aren't valuing him as a top 10 wide receiver in Dynasty, I think that's where he should be valued at this point. So there it is, guys, the 2025 NFL Draft Report for this week, the NFL Rookie Report, and Fantasy Dynasty Report for Week 7. If you're enjoying this content, please get over to the website, SS Football, fastest and easiest way to get there. For $9.99, you get access to all of our premium notebooks. You instantly get the Scouting Notebook and the Rankings Notebook. And then in April, we release the Draft Projections Notebook as well. So, on behalf of our sound tech engineer, David Nakano, and myself, thank you for joining us, and we look forward next time taking you from Saturday to Sunday.